going to get started here. So this is death to VMs and massive repos, Dockerizing a composer-based workflow in P8. If you don't want to be here, you're stuck now. I might make fun of you if you leave. So I'm Doug Dobrzynsky. My Twitter handle is Dobrzynsky. Very easy, simple to remember. On Drupal.org, I'm dobrzyns. I've been trying to switch over to that handle on other things, and unfortunately it's already taken. I work at PMMI Media Group. I'll get into that in a little bit here. So first, let's go ahead and talk about PMMI Media Group. It's a B2B in the packaging industry. So basically, we provide resources on packaging. They have 5 or 6 brands, which they have magazines, websites. They publish articles. It's actually really fascinating once you get into, or at least I found, thinking about things like designing packages that are easy to open without opening on their own. How do you do that consistently? At one point there was a fiasco where imprints on cans weren't staying. That's a problem if you have a can and it sweats and then the image comes off in your hand. How does that work? So they talk about a lot of that technologies. I'm a developer, programmer there. We support their sites. Their sites are in Drupal. They also have some applications in PHP, most using Yi, as well as some Node.js applications, I believe. I generally try not to touch those. So Drupal, I've actually been working with Drupal since fall of 2009. I started as a site builder at the college I was attending. I basically became their main web developer, which isn't ideal as a full-time student as well, but got into it that way. Got a job then after through my connections at college doing development here in Chicago. I'm also very interested in DevOps. Some people hate the term, some people love it, but it's the one that's used and is common, combining development, operations, and QA. We won't go into that too much. I also really like beer. I'm a big beer drinker, so if you ever want to woo me, you can go ahead and get me a beer. Just nothing hoppy. That's all I want to ask. So let's go about our agenda first. So we're going to get into the challenge of modern web app development. Some of those problems. We'll talk about virtual machines versus containers. We'll then go into why containers and why Docker specifically. I'll talk a bit about why Composer. Then I'll get into the actual development workflow using Docker as well as using Docker with Composer then. And I'll point out then some tools and frameworks to get started. So the challenge. Used to be you did web development, you needed a LAMP stack. Linux, Apache, MySQL, you were good to go. Now it is a lot more complicated. So you have Linux or some web server software. You have a database software, whether it be MySQL or PostgreSQL, that can vary. You might have different programming languages. You have JS frameworks now that you need to get in place. You might have different message queues, REST APIs, other backends. So there's lots of variations. How many of you actually set up web servers? Anyone in here? Are you able to set up one consistent web server configuration that works for all applications? No hands. So clearly that's a challenge now. There isn't a one-size-fits-all recipe. So let's get into the metaphor for a bit. You have your goods, your applications. They vary. As you can see, we have lots of different fruits here. They're all different shapes, sizes. If we think about shipping these fruits, how do you do that? It wasn't previously consistent. You'd have to have different handling methods. Obviously, shipping fruits is a lot different from shipping, say, electronics components. So when you say ship those from overseas here, how do you do that in a way that's consistent, that's easy to do without having to change the tooling to load and unload? So this is where Docker gets its metaphor. The solution was shipping containers. All the goods go into these consistent containers. Very easy to load and unload with the same machinery. You don't have to vary that. So let's talk a little bit then about VMs versus containers. Do any of you here use VMs right now? So looks like most. So a VM, I found, is very simple. You have your operating system or application environment. It's installed and a way to imitate hardware. I like to think of it as a machine within your machine. Fairly simple. Container is a little bit more of a nebulous term. I found when talking to people, they're like, wait, what's a container? It takes some getting used to. It's kind of like the nebulous node in Drupal. Once you get to know it and understand it, it makes sense. But if you say to someone, node, even if they know Drupal, they're like, wait, what are you talking about? So a container is basically an encapsulation of an application and all of its dependencies. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where modern applications may have different frameworks, JavaScript frameworks, different backends. So this packages it all together. So you have your application and every dependency you need. So looking at this in a bit more in depth to describe what a VM versus a container. So a VM, you have your hardware, which many of you probably running laptops. You have your host OS on that. You may be running Mac. You may be running Windows. You then have what's called a hypervisor or a virtualization environment. This virtualization environment then is running its own OS. It has the libraries that you need, and it has your application. A container, on the other hand, you have your hardware, you have your computer, your laptop, which runs its host OS, and then you have a container engine. In this case, we'll be talking specifically about Docker, and that container engine runs has your libraries and runs your application. You'll notice it gets out that second OS running on your machine. So it utilizes a lot of the existing kernel of your host hardware. So there's a layer there. You might be seeing already that this is going to possibly improve performance, since you're not running two OSs on your computer. Yes?
So my understanding is that if I want to run Docker on a Mac...
Docker on a Mac is an exception.
Okay.
Because you do need a hypervisor. Docker Toolbox provides a lightweight VM to do that, but if you're running this on Linux, you don't. So yes, I wondered if someone would ask that, because it is a bit of a lie, since Docker doesn't run natively on OS X.
Most people also seem to forget that the big difference, even on Windows and Mac, when you are running Docker and you do need a VM to support it, you only need the one VM, no matter how many containers are running.
Correct.
Unlike a VM where you have a hypervisor instance for every guest OS.
Yeah, and I'll talk about this a bit when I get into the advantages. So that's great, you're anticipating. You're already starting to put. There's one other.
I was going to mention Docker and Windows as well. It doesn't seem to be a performance
Pardon?
Just going to vent frustrations about Docker and Windows.
I don't use Windows just because I find that frustrating in general. But I can imagine. So, for those of you who are visual, this is a good picture. This is from an article called Docker Containers for the Masses. Gives you a good visual here. So you notice on a virtual machine, if you're running multiple VMs, you have a VM for each project. You have multiple OSs running. Each has their own libraries, their own database. You may have a couple, and then you may have your application on another VM. Has anyone ever run into a case where they're working, they get pulled to another project, they switch over, all of a sudden their computer's really slow, they're getting warnings that they're out of memory, wondering what's going on? Has that happened to anyone? What was the cause, if you're doing VM, out of curiosity?
Each virtual machine is using a ton of RAM, which is why I went out and bought more RAM for my before I started doing this.
Exactly. All of a sudden, you don't realize, like, oh crap, I have 3 computers running on my computer. And oh yeah, that's right, I started a cron process on this one that I forgot about that is using a ton of resources and network bandwidth as well. So it's easy to forget. Start running multiple, all of a sudden your computer's really slow. And I reached a point where I've had to actually just turn my computer off and lose work because of that. So once you have to start getting in the habit of either shutting down or sleeping your Vagrant machine as you're switching projects. One of the advantages of Docker and containers is you can run multiple containers at once with much less of a performance impact, since obviously it's not running an OS on each container. One of the other advantages of containers is, you'll notice by this diagram, is you can share libraries across containers. So on a virtual machine, if you have 2 that share libraries, you have to have a copy of the library on each virtual machine. So that's one of the other advantages to using containers. So we've already started to hit on this. So why containers? Utilizing shared resources makes them more efficient. Also, as I mentioned, since they're not running a separate OS for each container, that improves performance. The idea is that they're portable. You install Docker on any environment, Docker takes care of running everything. You should be able to move your containers around on any environment when Docker should just handle making that run. So it's also lighter weight, I guess I should say lighter weight than containers. And the other thing is it's self-contained. Going back to the definition of what is a container, it's an encapsulation of an application and its dependencies. So if I say, hey, I have this really cool Drupal site, and it has all these really cool fancy features and this one library that's really hard to find and download, I can just should be able to just hand this container off to this person, and if they have Docker, they can run it and should be able to see my site without having to worry about getting any libraries. It also makes it a lot easier since you don't have to, right now, say if you share a Drupal site, you have to share your code, make sure that they're on the right branch or the right tag, as well as give them a database. Possibly you might have to give them a Vagrant machine that has all of your libraries and different services that you need. So there you have 3 different pieces that you have to pass on to them. If your site has lots of content, obviously those MySQL dumps can get fairly large. Vagrant boxes can get fairly large fairly quickly if you're not careful. And so doing that has, it's a lot more to pass on, harder, versus you have one item, your container, that you pass on, and it has everything. So then, looking at why Docker. I'll go a little bit into some of the history, but containers aren't something new. It's been around quite some time, but what Docker did is it brought together existing Linux container technology. So it packaged, so to speak, into a more usable tool. It also extended existing functionality or technology that was out there, and one of the big key advantages of Docker is it gave through portable images so that you can, again, share your application and everything your application needs to run, and it provided a more user-friendly UI. Another big advantage is it's open source. We're at a Drupal camp. We love open source, so that's good. And Docker has actually become part of the Open Container Initiative. There are quite a few companies involved in this, different teams working to standardize around Docker and container technology. So there's support for Docker. It's not a small thing. And if you get more into the history, it's actually really amazing how fast Docker has grown and how fast it's evolved. We were looking at using Docker about a year ago, and before they introduced a lot of the new tooling, and it definitely wasn't ready to go prime yet, or wasn't easier, whereas now with all the different tools and components for Docker, it's a lot more mature, a lot easier to use, it's very powerful. If you go onto Docker, or Docker site, and look at everything, all the components and features, it's actually really amazing how much has come. So let's talk now a little bit about Composer. Has anyone here used Composer? Okay. Let's just get a sampling. How have you used Composer? A few, anyone?
Drupal 8.
Drupal 8.
The Symphony.
Symphony, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Elasticsearch. Has anyone used Composer with, say, Drupal 7 to manage all of their dependencies? So a few, some. Okay. So Composer, if you're not aware, is a PHP package management tool. It allows you to keep track of all your packages and versions. It's really nice. You use a composer.json file, set your requirements, you can set version dependencies, and so one of the advantages, thinking more in the Drupal context, is this case, when you do updates, for those of you who don't use Composer, right now, what is your process for updating modules?
So I have a shell script that will download one project at a time, fresh download, and then commit it to Git.
Okay.
So I run this manually for each module that needs to be updated. So I have my GUI window open in one window saying what needs to be downloaded, and then in the terminal window I use the shell script.
Okay. Anyone else?
Brush up.
Drush up. Okay.
Are you asking how do you update the libraries?
Yep.
I use Composer Manager.
Okay, so
And it sets all kinds of
So you're using Composer, Composer Manager. So Drush Up. For those of you using something manual like Drush Up or a custom script, how easy is it? Is it fun to do? How many of you?
Fun.
Well, maybe it's fun for some. I don't know. I'd like to meet that person who thinks Drush Up is fun. But yeah, so that's probably better to have a script and commit one by one. How many have come where you see, oh, updating modules, it's a git commit.
There's a Drush recipes out there that would simplify it.
Okay, that's good to know. So if you're doing Drush up and you run into an instance, I have before where I'm on support. They had done updates recently. Someone had just done, Drush up, updated all the modules at once, done one commit, and something broke somewhere in those updates. They may have, 10 plus modules that were updated. If maybe you don't know if it was updated one version or maybe they updated a major version. So now you have to go through the Git history, look in the info file, see, okay, what versions are they updating from? Maybe some people like doing that. I don't. It's not fun. The nice thing with Composer is it's easier to update and it's self-documenting. When you do a Composer update, it updates your composer.log file. Now you can look at one file and see the changes from the previous commit and look through that, and it'll show you the versions and what you can easily see what version was used previously and what version was used now. A lot easier, a lot less painful. It's actually, you might say, a little more fun if you want to go that far. Another thing relatedly is pinning or setting version constraints. You can set it to only do minor updates, which is probably a good practice. You probably don't want to do major updates automatically. But how many have ever run into a case where they do an update a module, find out, oh, this new version breaks X, so we can't update. How many have run into that? How many have run into that same problem a second time because they forgot and updated again? Lots of people. If you get into a development agency where you have multiple people working on the site and you're going through and updating 10 sites at once, how likely do you think it is that you're going to remember exactly what happened? I see one person shaking their head no. Probably not. So you could document this somewhere. Maybe you have a wiki that you document it there. Grant?
I'm just sort of listening and thinking, why haven't you mentioned DrushMake yet?
Yes, DrushMake is an alternative. Similar things. I'm not going into that in this presentation.
Okay.
I thought.
You said why Composer, and
Yeah.
one of my questions as to why would I stop, working with my team and having a DrushMake file for our projects, so that when you talk about updating modules, the way that I do this, I change the version, I push to a feature branch, our tests run, and I know if things fail before I ever even see the site.
Yeah. So that's another time. I just chose not to go into DrushMake. There's a lot of, that's a good point. And there's a lot of debate, DrushMake versus Composer. Going that one of the arguments for Composer is that it's PHP, community-wide standard, whereas DrushMake is a Drupal. From the keynote this morning, as he talked about, Drupal 8 is moving more towards eliminating Drupalisms. So that's one argument for Composer.
Yeah, I would agree with you there.
So, but yeah, that's a good point. DrushMake obviously takes care of that. So with Composer, you can pin to a certain version, and now in your composer.json, it's marked like, oh, this is set to this version. There's a reason for this. So, Eric?
Can you pin to do just security updates? The way that with DrushUp you can do the security update flag?
There isn't, as far as I know. Since it goes pretty much, it uses semantic versioning to detect changes. And I don't know what's going, that would actually be interesting, possibly for someone to write a way to do security updates. And one other of the biggest reasons, part of my title, Death to Massive Repos, if you get every module committed, your repos become very large, and then you're having that in your code, it's harder to go through. So this makes your repository a little smaller, a little cleaner, a little easier to keep track of, especially if you're working with people who don't put their modules in a custom folder and they're all mixed in together.
I'll say for security patches, you could almost set up something separate to just apply the patch directly as soon as possible, and then schedule your updates for when you can review them and do other things. So
Yeah,
different workflow, so it wouldn't need to be incorporated necessarily.
that's true.
The problem with treating security patches, especially this way, is that 3 or 4 module updates go by that you've been putting off. And one of them requires you to update your own code. And then a security patch comes along, and then you're stuck with 5 module updates, and you can't apply the security patch because you haven't applied the earlier one.
No, what I'm saying is you do Composer for most of your updates, and you got that as part of your process, but you have a separate cron job or whatever, however you want to do it, that it will apply the patch as soon as it comes out because it's security patch to Drupal.
So you're already
It's
setting
like
up
that,
state by
but
Composer.
mostly for Drupal,
Okay.
not for all the different modules and stuff.
So one other nice thing is there are tools to apply patches now using with a Composer-based workflow, and they actually work. So you no longer have to manually apply patches and then put the patch in the folder so that someone knows. It's actually I forget the exact syntax in JSON, but you have an area where you list the patches that you apply, and it applies those to the module. So it's actually very nice, a lot more automated in that sense. So let's get now into the development workflow using Docker. I've run into some people saying like, oh, Docker's really hard to get going. It's hard to get start up on. It's not quite ready, which I would go against that. Yesterday I was in the migration training, and it's like, no, it's not that migration isn't ready. It's just that migrations are usually complex. And so many of you are probably working with complex projects, so that adds. But getting into development workflow with Docker, I've actually heard some arguments that people say, wait, isn't Docker for deployments? And that's actually not true. Docker itself builds and develops inside of Docker containers. And so a better way to think about it is Docker provides building blocks. So if you think of it that way, you can really do a lot with Docker, as well as using Docker for CI, using Docker for deployment. So now, how many of you have ever created a virtual box? Did you have fun?
No.
How was it easy? Did it take long? Did you have it in like 5 minutes?
With Puppet, yes.
Okay. Yes, if you're using a configuration tool, it's a lot easier. But then there's the argument, oh, okay, well now I have to go learn Puppet, I have to learn Chef, I have to learn Ansible.
Not Puppet, Puppet,
Oh, I'm sorry.
which is an online configurator of virtual machines.
Okay, so yes, that's a lot easier.
By the way, you have the virtual box set up, but then it's installing the operating system. It takes forever.
So the nice thing with Docker is you can actually get up and going in one command. So looking at this, I broke it out into different lines. So you have Docker run, you're starting a new container, removing it once done. You're setting the volume for where your code will be available in the container. You're setting the default working directory. And then you're saying, I want to install these test libraries and save it in package.json.
It's a hell of a one line.
So, yeah, hell of a one line, very, very powerful. This is probably even quicker than using an online tool. It's one line, right going. So this kind of makes me think of this and feel like this. You get very excited. You can do a lot in that one line. You're kind of amazed, not sure what to do. But as I kind of hinted, it is a bit more complex. Obviously, Drupal is a more complex system. That example, by the way, was a Node.js application. So a little different than Drupal. So let's go a bit more in depth. So in general, we're going to have multi-container applications. It's generally, the general practice is to have a container for each service. So you'll generally have a container for PHP and Apache or Nginx. You'll have a container for your database. You might have a container for queues, web service APIs. If you're using a caching service, say Redis, you'll have a container for that. So multiple containers. So clearly we're already getting into more than one line. This is the nature of modern web applications. They're complex. There are lots of moving pieces. So here we have Docker Compose. So what you can do is you document and configure all of the application service dependencies. And it uses YAML, which is starting to become very familiar if you're working with D8, yet another markup language, which if you were in Krejci's presentation, as she pointed out, is either a markup or a language. And you then have single command startup. So you would have Docker Compose up. For anyone who uses Vagrant, it's very similar. And the nice thing too is you can set environment variables. So this is very, very powerful. You know, obviously you might have different credentials on a test server than production. There's going to be, especially with Drupal, different configurations. Mail server, obviously, again, if you were in Krejci's presentation this morning, building on that, you don't want to send out test emails to your client. You want to have that configured so that your staging mail server doesn't send out user resets to everyone at the business without you realizing. So this is something you can account for. So let's look at a simple Docker Compose file. So here they're setting which version this is for the setup. Then they're defining their services. So then web, Redis, DB, each one of those refers to a container. That'll be the container name then. So you're setting where your build directory is. So this says use this working directory. You're going to say what other containers does this depend on. So web, obviously we're going to need our DB and we're going to need our Redis container. And then Redis, you'll notice it's using an image. This is from the official Docker Hub repository. So it'll go and get that image, get everything set up. It's using the Postgres then official Docker Hub image for the DB container. So fairly simple, very nice to set up, very clean. Now let's look at something a little more complex. So here I have two containers. I have my MySQL container as well as my web container. You'll notice here I'm setting the container name then separately. For MySQL, I'm using the image. I'm setting a version then for that image to use. I want to use 5.7. This is an example of setting environment variables in a bad way. You would not want to do this and commit it to your repository. So this is one of those do as I say, not as I do in this example. But to show, obviously here you would you would actually use the environment variables instead and set that. I'm going to set the ports then and expose that port. So then for web, you'll notice I have build in the current directory, and I am setting a separate Docker file. So I'm saying for this build, I'm not going to use an image. I'm actually going to build this. Again, the environment variables, just some examples of some things that you might set as environment variables. So install profile, Drupal user, password, all the standard stuff. Setting the DB URL. Ports again, I'm setting the volumes available. And then you'll notice there that there's that links. So I'm linking it to the MySQL container so that that is available from the web container. Obviously, our Drupal site is going to need a database. Yes?
Simple, I guess, stupid question. This is all the contents of one file?
Correct,
Is that
yes.
right?
Yeah, this is Docker compose file.
Okay.
So I just separated separate columns so we could get it all on one screen. So you'll notice I had that custom Docker file. So here I'm using actually the PHP official image from Docker Hub. You'll notice I'm setting what version I want to use. Again, environment variables that you would not want to set in this way since this will be committed. You'll notice I'm exposing port 80. And then I can run some commands. So I'm enabling rewrite module. There I'm installing PHP extensions you'll need. And you'll notice it's very simple. Apt-get update. If you've been writing bash commands to do some of this stuff, it's actually fairly simple to transition. If you're running commands on the command line, you should be familiar with this. The syntax run is fairly self-explanatory. So then you'll notice this Docker PHP extension install, specifically to Docker, saying I want to install these PHP extensions. So then when I run Docker compose up, it'll then create the MySQL container using the image from Docker Hub. Then it'll come into and create the web container and run this Docker file to create this. So this is a continuation of that same file. So here you'll notice I'm setting recommended PHP.ini values. So here you'll notice I'm just outputting to a file these settings. So if you're in kind of the mindset of thinking about process and how you're getting there, what you need to do, what commands you need to run, these are kind of some of the things. If you configure a VirtualBox, you would probably do some of these same things in setting all this. And this is nice. It's another way of scripting it using Docker. So then you can actually commit and share images. Very nice. So to commit, it's just one command, Docker commit. You'll say what container you want to commit, and you'll give it a name. And then what you can do is Docker Hub actually has its own repository for images There are paid versions where you can set up teams and have advanced permissions, so that's a nice way to share. And if you do that, you have the Docker push command to where you can upload your container images in there. So one thing that's really nice about this is if you're ever, say, working on a site midstream on some new development feature, maybe you're building some views, some new content types, you have all that, you're going, you're in the middle, and all of a sudden you have a client like, quick, the site's broken, it's an emergency, you have to fix this. And it's the one you're working on. You have all this work in progress that you need to save. You're not quite ready to get it all into code yet. You maybe could just use feature save, put it in code, make just a commit of work in progress, do something like that. If you don't want to do that, you could create a database dump and have that, then go get the production database, download that, make sure you check out the right code, then import your production database so you have that and can work and see what's going on. Nice thing with this is if you're using images, especially if you're using images for deployment, you have your image from production. You can then just go ahead and do Docker commit, save your work in progress, build the image from production, and when you're ready to go back, you can switch back to build using your image that you created of your work in progress. So it's very nice in that way. It also allows you to very easily share in progress if you have to hand it off to someone else. Again, you have one artifact that you pass on to them. You don't have to say, okay, you need to go check out this. Say maybe I have my own branch on my own fork, I push it up, but I don't have all the working code, so I also have to hand off my database in some way, but it's too big for a lot of uploaders, so now you have to upload it, then you have to download it, and it can get very slow and tedious versus you have one image that you're passing on. Another really cool thing with Docker is if you're using Docker Hub, is you can set up automated builds linking your Bitbucket and GitHub account. So then every time new work is committed, it'll create a new image. So you can get an image of the latest work in progress if you have a develop branch. And it's really nice that way. You don't then have to say, okay, I'm going to pull all the code, download it, okay, I have to make sure to clear cache, run updates, revert features, all that good Drupal stuff. Now you just have the image of the current latest development state. So this is really nice and really cool. So now let's talk about it with using Docker. There's actually one slide for this. So you need Docker, or you need Composer. So you'll install Composer in your Docker file, and then you run Composer install in your Docker file. And now you have Composer. So obviously there's the whole Composer workflow as well that's in there, but adding it into Docker isn't hard. So now let's talk about some of the tools frameworks out there. There actually is an official Drupal Docker repository on Docker Hub. So it's really nice. You can get going with Docker and Drupal in one command. Docker run, you set its name, some Drupal link. We're going to link this to a MySQL container and Drupal. Bam. Done. If you want to use PostgreSQL, very similar. We're just going to use Postgres for the container. The one caveat on this is it doesn't make sure that all the extensions necessary are installed, even if they're required by popular plugins. So this is provided more as a starting point to create your own project. So you obviously then would want to create your own custom container based on that. One other framework out there is from Ricardo-Amaro on GitHub, docker-drupal. One of the things I don't like about this that goes against convention is he actually uses a single Docker container for Drupal using Linux, Apache, and MySQL. And the other thing he does is he actually doesn't use an official, obviously since he's creating its own, he doesn't actually use an official image for MySQL from Docker. He actually is literally just doing an apt-get install and installing everything for MySQL. So it kind of defeats the purpose a little bit of using Docker. It would be more advantageous to use the official Docker image.
Why? I understand the performance benefits to having separate containers for each process, but why is the blessed MySQL or Postgres or whatever image better than one built with apt-get?
That's true. That's more convention. It's generally better or recommended to use an official Docker Hub repo when you're using Docker. Obviously, that's debatable.
Actually, it does have an effect of a layer system. It takes longer to build each time because the build file, you have to pull everything down and reinstall it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're pulling an image from the hub, you're only pulling in the binary that the hub built for you.
Yeah.
So it's a lot faster. Plus, you're really not supposed to actually instruct Docker to multiplex its one single process per container, which is what that container does using supervisor D. It's a bad idea.
Yeah. So, tools and parameters for Drupal and Composer with Docker. There aren't any. I'm hopefully working on one. So my goal is, we've actually convinced our manager at our new place that we should do all new sites from now on in D8, he approved. So my goal is to hopefully use Docker and Composer and then create a framework which I will then open source and make that available. So that's my goal. This project for my first one keeps getting pushed back, so I right now don't have a good timeline, but hopefully at some point this will be a thing. If other people want to get started and collaborate, I am very open to that.
Yeah, I've already been trying to work on that for a year now.
Okay. And a lot has changed in a year too. So now it is, because we, like I said, we at my former company tried to do it and ran into a lot of issues. A lot of tools didn't exist then, they weren't as mature. So now it should be a lot easier. But again, like I mentioned earlier, it's not that Docker isn't ready, it's that projects are complex, Drupal is complex. There are still Drupalisms that we have to account for, so that does add some complexity, take some extra time. So I'll make these slides available and update the session info on the MidCamp website so that you have this. There are lots of resources out there, lots of articles out there. So then, one other thing, I guess we can go into questions before the end of announcements. Any other questions, thoughts?
So, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that when you're doing that push to Docker up, you're sort of cheating because you said you're not going to have any big repos, but it looks an awful lot to me like you've got this binary repo, which has got to be bigger than my text repo. Am I wrong?
You know, I actually haven't looked at size and compared. The one advantage is you're keeping separate repositories, though. So what I meant with the large repositories is that's, I guess, applies a little bit more to using Composer, is you don't have all your modules in your code. So this, yes, you do have something else. Go ahead.
So on Docker Hub, there is an official Drupal repository. Do you recommend using that?
It is good to use as a starting point. But like I mentioned, it isn't meant for, out of the box use as a framework. It's meant more as a tool to get going, to set up some of the initial things. You still then have to go and make sure you have all your extensions that you need and then create your own image from that. Eric?
Could you touch on the steps that would be involved in taking an existing project with a massive repo and you have your core files tracked and all your modules tracked? What would be involved with converting that to a Composer situation where you can just have one sleek?
So Johnny's actually smiling. My recommendation would be don't. My recommendation would be to use this on new projects, just because the structure changes a lot. You have to do a lot of custom work. Well, since Composer installs everything in your vendor directory, that obviously isn't where Drupal wants your modules. So you have to account for a lot of those Drupalisms. So using it can be done, but I wouldn't recommend it just because there's such a big structural change.
As a side note, could it be done with DrushMake? Could you take an existing project, massive repo?
I've seen tools for both vendors to map an existing project into Drush and also for Composer.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen those. I'd be curious to look at them.
Yeah, you said, can you, the question might be, should you?
Yeah. maybe
Yeah,
that's the best
yes, you
question.
can. Should you? I wouldn't recommend it,
Okay.
especially if it's a large, complex project.
I believe the AAA Drupal Composer, whatever that one was called, I think that has that workflow built into it.
Okay.
And yes.
I'll preface with the fact that I'm fairly new to Docker,
Mhm.
still bit naive. But when I'm seeing these explanations, when I see your scripting inside your Docker config files, I'm seeing a lot of Debianisms, which implies that you're using Debian or Ubuntu as your base OS
Yeah.
for this development. That implies that the services that you're linking in are also Debian or Ubuntu based. And yeah, I'm not seeing that in a lot of the designations. How do you deal with the situation where your developer sets up their development Docker for Ubuntu, but the hosting environment they have to host their production Docker is, say, under CentOS?
So the goal of Docker is Docker runs on Linux, and Docker's goal is to handle those differences, so that you shouldn't have to think about what your host OS is, since Docker is handling that.
So that's an even better argument why you should not build these one stack or one container stacks, including all the services, because they're probably very platform dependent, built into Docker.
No,
No.
it's more that a Debian-based container that lives on a kernel that happens to be run by CentOS is fine because
It's abstracted.
it's self-contained.
Yeah.
So if you need, there's a version of you'll see inside that container already the versions in the parent environments to reference.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, sorry.
So it's Composer Manager. There's 777 and 888 versions. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm currently using Ansible with Vagrant. And so I already have some of the advantages you've talked about. I see there's some disadvantages to what I'm working with. But I'm sort of looking for a significant enough advantage to moving to Docker that it's worth changing my current practices. I'm not seeing anything yet. Can you think of any really compelling arguments why Docker is better than Docker with Docker Composer is better than Ansible with Vagrant?
I actually haven't used Ansible, but it looks like someone else has and hasn't.
There's two reasons. One, size. With a VM, especially if most distros of Unix, you're going to have some kind of a swap file and a whole bunch of additional overhead. And you're going to incur at least a 1.5 gigabyte overhead in most distributions to run a VM just on disk versus the same kind of implementation on a container. And I just forgot what the other one was, but that's one of the big ones. The build time also tends to be a lot faster.
Yeah.
Because if you're using an image, you just pull down the image layers and you're done. You can also roll back to particular image points, and that's not very easy with a VM situation. You can in theory do that with vSphere, but most people don't have vSphere on their laptop.
Yeah, there's an article out there that did some tests comparing the speeds of VMs to Docker that I actually don't think I listed. I'll have to go ahead and add that, but this person did some really extensive tests, and it was a presentation. I forget where, but
If I remember correctly, the majority of the results were there was next to no overhead except for this method. That was the only real overhead. That's because the layer system is hacked.
okay.
So if you've got Docker containers and you spin them up, and then you want to change some configuration, like a PHP INI setting, you can do that.
Yeah,
Or you have to redefine that and spin up the whole container again.
you can change that and it'll detect and update.
Where do you change it to? Do you edit your PHP INI file in the container?
So what you would do is you'll notice in the build file, I was setting some PHP INI files. You would change it there.
Okay, so you can't change it in the...
I mean, your goal is, I guess it depends how your workflow is. If you're just passing on images and using those images and not actually building, so if you're a developer right now, you might get a Docker Compose file and build every time. Whereas if you're creating one image and, like you create a virtual box and then you pass that on to everyone else, say you use Ansible, you would use Ansible to create your virtual box, upload that somewhere, and then everyone would use that virtual box. So in that case, you could just change it, but since you're using Docker, you would the goal is to document your settings and configuration.
Excuse me, I wanted to speak to that other gentleman's question earlier. The main thing, because I had the same setup that you had, the main thing that got me away from just using like Vagrant, say VirtualBox, and like throwing Docker in the mix, was that I could deploy a lot faster once I had a Docker container. I was doing like live provisioning on the VMs up in rack space, and it takes a long time if you have to spin up a new one. But if you have Docker, you can deploy very quickly. So like you basically just keep Vagrant and Ansible, but you provision the containers using Vagrant and Ansible, and then store the containers up in Docker. So that's what convinced me.
So just a few quick announcements since we're at time. Don't forget the Sprint Sunday. It's not here in this building. It's across the street and up or south a little bit. So they have all skills, that's a 10. And don't forget feedback. I'll get the slides uploaded to my session. So thank you.